It started with a letter. A single sheet of paper, bold red letters screaming from the top, immediate action required. Jack Lawson stood on his porch, sipping his morning coffee, staring at the envelope like it had personally insulted him. The address was his, sure enough, but the sender? Greenbrier Homeowners Association. He scoffed. That's cute. Jack had lived here for years, long before the HOA even existed. He had never signed a contract, never agreed to their rules, and legally, his house wasn't under their jurisdiction. So what the hell did they want? Tearing the envelope open, he skimmed the contents. Violations. Apparently, his mailbox didn't match the uniform standard. His paint color wasn't on the approved palette. His lawn was 0.75 inches too tall. And, as the cherry on top, his car, a beautifully restored '69 Mustang, was deemed an eyesore because it didn't fit the aesthetic vision of the community. Jack let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. The level of pettiness was impressive. He crumpled the letter into a ball and tossed it into the recycling bin, brushing it off as some overzealous HOA busybody trying to flex authority where they had none. By noon, the matter was all but forgotten, until a sharp knock at his door made it clear this wasn't over. Standing on his porch was a woman in her late 50s, dressed like a bureaucrat with a crisp blouse and a cheap HOA badge pinned to her chest like it gave her federal authority. She wore the look of someone who expected obedience before she even had to speak. "I assume you got our notice," she said, skipping any pleasantries. Jack took a slow sip of his coffee. "I did. And I assume you know I'm not in your HOA." Her smile was thin, sharp, calculated. "That's what we need to discuss." "There's nothing to discuss," he replied lazily, leaning against the doorframe. "My house isn't under your jurisdiction." "That's incorrect," she said smoothly, pulling out a clipboard like it held the secrets of the universe. "This entire neighborhood follows HOA guidelines, and we can't make exceptions." Jack sighed. He had dealt with his fair share of power-hungry bureaucrats before, but there was something particularly grating about people who acted like suburban dictators. He folded his arms, smirking. "Let me save you some time. You don't have authority over my property." Her expression tightened. "Sir, we're trying to maintain community standards. If you refuse to comply, there will be consequences." Jack raised an eyebrow. "Like what? A strongly worded letter?" She exhaled sharply, her patience thinning. "Fines. Potential legal action. We have ways of ensuring compliance." That amused him. He gave her a slow, knowing grin. "Oh yeah? Try it. Let's see how that works out for you." Marge Whitmore, Jack now caught the name on her badge, glared at him before turning on her heel and marching off as if she'd just won the battle. But Jack had seen this kind of fight before, and he knew one thing for certain. This was just the beginning. The next morning, Jack stepped onto his porch, stretching as the sun rose over the neighborhood. The air was crisp, the sky clear, a perfect day to ignore the HOA. But as he reached for his newspaper, his hand froze mid-air. A bright orange notice was taped to his front door. He yanked it free, his eyes narrowing as he read the latest HOA-issued nonsense. Violations, again. His grass was allegedly too tall by exactly 0.75 inches. His mailbox was still non-compliant. And, in an impressive display of overreach, the HOA claimed that his Mustang, parked in his own driveway, was a visual disruption to the harmony of the community. Jack let out a low whistle, shaking his head. These people weren't just persistent, they were obsessed. Crumpling the notice, he tossed it into the trash and went inside, thinking that would be the end of it. He should have known better. That afternoon, a white utility truck rumbled to a stop in front of his house. Jack, sipping a fresh cup of coffee, watched through his front window as a man in a green uniform stepped out, clipboard in hand. The guy looked hesitant, shifting his weight as he stared at the work order like he wasn't sure he should be here. Jack stepped outside, resting a hand against the porch railing. "Can I help you?" The landscaper glanced up. Yeah, we were called out to trim the yard. HOA sent in the order." Jack's grip on his mug tightened, but his voice stayed even. "I didn't hire you." Before the worker could respond, Marge Whitmore materialized from across the street, arms crossed, wearing that smug little smirk that made Jack's blood pressure rise. "We took the liberty of arranging the service for you," she said, her tone clipped. "Since you refuse to maintain your property to HOA standards, the association is stepping in to ensure compliance." Jack chuckled, shaking his head. "You're joking, right?" She didn't blink. "The cost will be added to your outstanding fines." Jack let out a slow exhale, setting his coffee cup on the porch railing before fixing her with a look that could cut through steel. "I don't have any outstanding fines because I'm not in your HOA." Marge's lips pressed together. The landscaper, sensing the tension, took a step back, muttering, "Yeah, I think I'll head out," before getting back in his truck and peeling away. Jack turned back to Marge, arms folded across his chest. "Looks like you're fresh out of enforcers." Her face reddened, frustration bubbling just beneath the surface. "You think you're above the law?" Jack grinned. "No. I just think you have no idea how the law works." Marge stormed off without another word, but within the hour, a new bold red letter appeared in Jack's mailbox, this time stamped with the words, "Final warning." He didn't even bother opening it. By that evening, Jack could feel the shift in the neighborhood. Some of his neighbors seemed amused by his ongoing battle, nodding at him in solidarity when they walked by. But others, the ones who clung to HOA control like it was a religion, started avoiding eye contact. A few whispered behind their hands, casting nervous glances in his direction. Then, the next morning, the real insanity began. Jack stepped outside and froze. His trash cans were gone. Not just moved. Gone. He checked up and down the street, but they were nowhere to be found. Stolen. By noon, he had a bigger problem. He turned on his sprinklers, expecting the usual morning mist across his lawn. Instead, nothing. He checked the system and found that someone had tampered with the water line. Then came the noise complaints. The first letter accused him of playing loud music late at night. Which was funny, because he had been out of town that entire weekend. The second warned him about multiple reports of disruptive behavior. Jack laughed. They were making things up now. That night, as he sat on his porch, watching the streetlights flicker on, he spotted movement across the street. Marge. She stood with Ellie Hargrove, the HOA president, and two other board members, whispering, glancing toward his house. Jack could feel it. The HOA was done playing nice. They weren't just trying to fine him. They weren't just trying to intimidate him. They were coming for him. And for the first time in this ridiculous fight, he wondered just how far they'd go. The knock on Jack's door came earlier than expected. He had barely finished his first cup of coffee when he heard the sharp rap 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 against the wood, urgent and authoritative. Not Marge this time. No, she wouldn't have the guts after yesterday's little stunt. Instead, when he swung the door open, two uniformed police officers stood on his porch, hands resting casually on their belts. "Morning," the taller officer said, his tone even. "Sir, we received a complaint from the Greenbrier Homeowners Association regarding a dispute over property regulations." Jack sighed, running a hand through his hair. So this was their next move. Behind the officers, standing a few feet back with her arms crossed like a smug school principal, was Marge Whitmore, radiating triumph. She wasn't smiling, but Jack could see it in her eyes. She thought she'd won. The shorter officer cleared his throat. "Are you refusing to comply with the HOA's regulations?" Jack folded his arms. I'm not in the HOA. The two officers exchanged glances before looking back at Marge. The taller one asked, "Ma'am, is this property actually part of your HOA?" Jack watched, amused, as Marge stiffened, suddenly realizing she was standing on a very unstable foundation. "Well," she faltered, "it's within the neighborhood, so it falls under." "That's not what I asked," the officer cut in. "Is his property legally under the HOA's jurisdiction?" Silence. Marge's lips parted, but no words came out. Jack almost felt bad for her. Almost. The officer turned back to him. "Sir, do you have proof of exemption?" Without a word, Jack stepped inside, grabbed a folder from his desk, and handed it over. The officer flipped through the documents, his expression unreadable. After a moment, he closed the folder and handed it back. "Looks like you're right." Marge gasped. "What?" "But..." The officer held up a hand. "Ma'am, unless he's breaking an actual law, there's nothing we can do." Jack leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching as Marge's confidence crumbled. "This isn't over," she hissed under her breath before storming off, the officers giving Jack an apologetic nod before following. Jack smiled. It was the first time he had actually seen her rattled. But the HOA wasn't done with him. Not even close. By the time he woke up the next morning, they had already launched their next attack. It started with an anonymous report to Child Protective Services. Jack had no kids, no family living with him, no reason for CPS to ever be involved in his life. So when a social worker showed up, clipboard in hand, asking about unsafe living conditions and neglect, he barely contained his rage. He didn't yell. He didn't curse. He simply invited the caseworker inside, offered her coffee, and handed over the security footage from his front porch. The footage clearly showed Marge leaving his property just hours before the CPS report had been filed. People weaponizing government agencies is, unfortunately, not uncommon, the caseworker sighed, rubbing her temples. But filing false reports is illegal. Jack smirked. "You don't say." He wasn't the only one, either. After asking around, he discovered two other families in the neighborhood, people who had spoken out against the HOA in the past, had also been hit with sudden CPS investigations over the years. Marge was using children as leverage to silence people. Jack wasn't just angry anymore. He was done. That afternoon, a new letter appeared in his mailbox. Not a fine. Not a violation notice. This time, it was a foreclosure notice. Jack laughed. Actually laughed. These idiots were trying to steal his house. He read through the document carefully, shaking his head in disbelief. The HOA had compiled thousands of dollars in fake fines, and since he refused to pay, they were claiming the legal right to place a lien on his property and begin foreclosure proceedings. Jack drove straight to his lawyer. By the time the HOA received their legal notice ordering them to immediately cease and desist, Jack had gathered every document, every piece of evidence, every shred of proof that they had been harassing him illegally. The following day, he stood outside with his morning coffee, watching as Marge and Ellie stood across the street, talking in hushed tones. Jack smiled. They had finally realized who they were messing with. Jack didn't wait for the HOA to make their next move, he made his first. By the time Marge and Ellie realized what was happening, the cease and desist letters had already landed on their desks. The Greenbrier HOA board members all formally warned that their continued harassment was now legally actionable. He had also copied his lawyer into every email thread, ensuring that every accusation they hurled at him from now on would be met with an immediate legal response. But that wasn't nearly enough. Jack spent the next few days digging. If the HOA wanted to play dirty, he was more than happy to return the favor, legally, of course. It wasn't hard to find inconsistencies once he started pulling HOA records, reviewing meeting minutes, and talking to a few fed-up neighbors who had long suspected something shady. The deeper he went, the uglier the truth became. Ellie Hargrove, the HOA president, had been funneling HOA funds for landscaping expenses that just so happened to match the upgrades made to her own yard. Rick Caldwell, the HOA vice president, had built a massive backyard deck without any permits, a direct violation of the same HOA regulations he had fined others for breaking. And Marge Whitmore, the ever-present enforcer, had her own lawn documented as non-compliant in past HOA inspections, yet had never received a fine. Jack had everything he needed to destroy them. And he didn't have to lift a finger, the neighborhood did it for him. One by one, he leaked the details into the Greenbrier Neighborhood Facebook group. At first, it was subtle, an anonymous tip here, a pointed question there, but once the accusations gained traction, it spread like wildfire. Neighbors who had blindly paid fines for years began demanding refunds. Homeowners who had grudgingly followed the HOA's endless rules started questioning why board members weren't held to the same standards. What had once been whispered complaints behind closed doors turned into outright defiance. Then, Jack uncovered something that sent the entire neighborhood into an uproar: the HOA was planning to sell them out. Hidden deep within the HOA's records, buried under legal jargon and backdoor negotiations, was a proposal to sell off large portions of the neighborhood to a real estate developer. The deal, spearheaded by Ellie, would force many homeowners into selling their properties at below-market rates, allowing the developer to tear down houses and replace them with high-density townhomes and commercial units. Jack posted everything. Screenshots of the contract, HOA emails discussing how to present the sale as a community benefit, even notes from meetings where Ellie had reassured board members that homeowners wouldn't realize what was happening until it was too late. The fallout was immediate. A neighborhood-wide emergency meeting was called. It wasn't an official HOA meeting, it was a full-blown revolt. Neighbors demanded answers, voices raised in fury as Ellie, Rick, and Marge tried, and failed, to spin the situation. Ellie's voice wavered as she claimed, this was always meant to improve property values. The crowd wasn't buying it. You were going to sell us out, someone shouted. You're lining your own pockets, another neighbor accused. Marge, for once, was speechless, her smugness completely gone. Rick had paled, visibly shaken as homeowners turned on them. Jack, standing near the back, arms folded, simply watched as the very people the HOA had spent years controlling tore them apart. And then came the final blow, the petition. Homeowners lined up to sign a formal demand for an internal HOA audit. But even worse for Ellie and her lackeys? Another petition had started circulating. This one wasn't just demanding an audit. It was calling for the complete dissolution of the Greenbrier HOA. Ellie's face went sheet white when she saw it. And for the first time since this battle had begun, Jack saw fear in her eyes. The courtroom was packed, neighbors taking time off work just to witness what everyone knew would be the final nail in the HOA's coffin. On one side, Ellie Hargrove and her board sat stiffly, their attorney flipping through paperwork with the kind of resignation that said he already knew this case was dead on arrival. On the other side, Jack Lawson sat calm, confident, with a thick folder of legal documents stacked neatly in front of him. The judge barely glanced at the HOA's argument before cutting straight to the point. Is his property legally under your HOA? Silence. Ellie cleared her throat, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. Well, it's within the neighborhood, so technically. The judge raised an eyebrow. Yes or no? Another long pause. Finally, the HOA's attorney sighed. No, Your Honor. And just like that, it was over. The judge dismissed the case, but before Ellie and her board could even breathe, Jack stood. Your Honor, I'd like to file a counterclaim for harassment, defamation, and repeated trespassing on my property. The HOA board visibly paled. The judge leaned back, intrigued. Do you have evidence? Jack smirked as he placed every letter, every fine, every video recording onto the table. The courtroom erupted. By the time the dust settled, the Greenbrier HOA was dead. The city's investigation confirmed years of financial mismanagement. Ellie and her cronies resigned in disgrace. Homeowners who had been forced to pay endless fines demanded refunds. Some neighbors stopped paying dues altogether. Others pushed for full dissolution. Within weeks, the HOA was officially disbanded. Jack watched the transformation unfold from his porch. The once cookie-cutter neighborhood now had colorful doors, unique mailboxes, and, gasp, driveways that didn't all match. People finally felt free. His biggest victory, though? Ellie was moving. Jack spotted her stuffing boxes into the back of an SUV, her movement stiff with humiliation. She caught his eye for only a second before looking away. Jack lifted his glass in a mock toast. Sweet, sweet karma. As her car pulled out of the driveway for the last time, Jack leaned back in his chair, letting the evening breeze wash over him. The HOA had tried to break him. Instead, he had buried them. But it begs the question, how far would an HOA go if no one fought back? Have you ever felt powerless against HOA, or Karen, rules? Share your experiences below. Let's see who had it worse.